It wasn't the tone of her voice that caught people's attention. It was the silence, the kind that spreads faster than turbulence, faster than spilled wine. Samantha D. Royce stood quietly in the boarding lane for first class, her boarding pass held steady in her left hand, her right resting calmly on the strap of her black laptop bag. Her coat was plain, her shoes didn't gleam. Her presence, though, was impossible to ignore even if they tried to. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, stepping slightly in front of her, palm raised like a barrier. "This lane is for first class only." Samantha didn't blink. She handed over her ticket without a word. The attendant scanned it, frowned slightly, then looked her up and down the way people do when they've already made up their mind. "I think you might be in the wrong lane," the woman said, voice softer now, but still coated in that sugary authority people reserve for correcting the help. Behind Samantha, a white man in a golf shirt and leather shoes walked right past. No one stopped him. The scanner beeped green, and the gate opened wide like privilege had a key. Samantha remained still. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, no edge, no attitude, just a calm that made the attendant's smile falter. "If you'll check the seat number again." The attendant glanced down, blinked, and this time her brows twitched, not in apology, but in disbelief. Then came the whisper, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't said at all. "These people, always trying it." A small scoff from the next passenger in line. A quick glance exchanged between two staff members behind the counter. Then came the boxed meal. Not a menu, not even a tray, just a sealed plastic box with an orange sticker slapped across it, Economy Reserve. No one else in first class got one. Just her. The man seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward the window, as if her presence somehow contaminated his air. Another passenger 2 rows up turned back, whispered something to the woman beside him. The word quota floated faintly in the air. Samantha heard all of it, every syllable, but her face didn't flinch. She just unfolded the linen napkin on her lap and clicked her seatbelt into place. She had no interest in making a scene. Not yet. Not when there were still names to remember, still moments to observe, still roles being played. The plane hadn't even left the ground, but the story had already taken off. No one knew who she was. Not yet. But they were about to. And when they did, when they finally looked at the manifest, at the red-circled name that every executive had been briefed on, the turbulence wouldn't be coming from the sky. It would be coming from 30,000 feet below. Samantha D. Royce didn't grow up learning how to belong in places like first class. She grew up learning how not to be noticed, raised by a single mother in a small town outside Atlanta. Samantha was taught to keep her head down, her voice soft, and her ambitions tucked away just far enough to not threaten anyone. The lessons weren't written down, but they were clear. Don't correct people when they mispronounce your name. Don't ask for more than you're given. And never under any circumstances act like you expect to be treated better than anyone else. That was how her mother survived. That was how most people she knew survived. But Samantha had learned a second language over the years. The language of boardrooms, investor decks, quarterly earnings, and closed-door negotiations, where no one expected her to be the smartest person in the room until she didn't change who she was. She just stopped making herself small. The flight was headed to San Francisco, where Samantha was scheduled to speak at an invite-only roundtable, hosted by one of the most influential venture capital firms on the West Coast. What they didn't know, at least, not most of them, was that she wasn't coming as a guest speaker. She was the new managing director of KRV Capital, a firm quietly acquiring strategic positions in underperforming but publicly loved brands, including, ironically, the very airline she was flying with. Her team had instructed her not to draw attention, not to interfere, and not to reveal her role until after the internal assessment phase concluded. This wasn't just a flight. It was part of a long-term evaluation of service standards, customer experience, and unspoken cultural patterns that could influence valuation. And Samantha, sitting in 2A, wasn't just a passenger. She was the baseline test. Yet even knowing all that, even understanding the structural nature of bias and the psychology behind perception, the cold sting of assumption still landed like a slap. She didn't expect special treatment. She simply expected fairness. But expectation was a slippery thing, and every minute aboard that plane was a lesson in how quickly perception became policy. The man across the aisle had spoken twice to the attendant about a seating mix-up. The woman in 1D kept glancing back at Samantha with a kind of cautious curiosity, the same way one might study someone walking through the wrong entrance of a private club. No one said anything openly hostile. That wasn't how it worked anymore. Bias wore better clothes now. It smiled. It used polite tones. It handed you plastic utensils while offering others stainless steel. The cabin crew wasn't cruel. They were just conditioned. Samantha knew this. She'd read enough reports, overseen enough HR audits to know that people often didn't see their own habits until someone held up a mirror. The mirror didn't need to accuse. It just needed to reflect. And this flight was full of reflections. Every time she requested water and received it without lemon, while others had theirs freshly garnished. Every time someone asked if she worked in aviation. Every time her silence was mistaken for submission. It was all being noted. Not for revenge, not even for reprimand, but for the simple fact that culture eats policy for breakfast. And no rebranding campaign could undo what the front line revealed. In truth, Samantha wasn't angry. Not in the way people often assume a woman like her must be. She wasn't carrying resentment. She was carrying data. She was collecting patterns, not enemies. She had long understood that change didn't come from fury, it came from evidence, from repetition, from undeniable, quiet proof. And right now, that proof was being handed to her, tray by tray, interaction by interaction. Behind her composure was a slight ache not of ego, but of disappointment. Disappointment that in 25 her presence in a luxury cabin still sparked side glances, that her name on a boarding pass still needed a second check. She wasn't asking for affirmation, just recognition, the same kind anyone else with her credentials and ticket would receive without pause. But instead, she had become a test of everyone else's comfort. Her quiet confidence disturbed a balance they didn't know they'd been taught to protect. And yet, Samantha wasn't here to disturb. She was here to watch. She glanced at the seat map on her screen. 24 first-class passengers, only 2 people of color. The service scores for this cabin on this route had dropped 9% over the last fiscal year. Her firm had noted it. Now she was experiencing it. The most telling part. No one thought they were doing anything wrong, and maybe that was the real problem. The woman 2 seats over had leaned in slightly to ask if Samantha was with one of the athletes. She had smiled when she said it, as if it were a compliment. Samantha responded with a smile of her own and said nothing. That was the 4th time in 2 years someone had asked her a version of that same question. As if the only way a black woman could sit in first class was if she were attached to fame, or fortune, or both, never as a power in her own right. But Samantha didn't correct people anymore. She observed them. Let them reveal what they believed about the world. Let them write the first draft of their own accountability. Somewhere in the rear cabin, a child cried. Somewhere up front, champagne bottles popped. And in between, in the soft hum of luxury at cruising altitude, Samantha sat quietly, not needing to assert her place, only waiting for others to realize who exactly they had underestimated. Roughly 40 minutes into the flight, the man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. He had been pretending not to watch Samantha for most of the trip, but subtlety wasn't his strength. At one point, as a flight attendant reached his row, he leaned slightly into the aisle and said in a low voice that wasn't meant to be overheard, "I think someone may have gotten mixed up in the manifest. I don't mean anything by it, but someone like her doesn't usually show up in these seats." The flight attendant gave a brief, polite chuckle, the kind people use when they're unsure whether to correct or agree, and replied with, "I'm sure everything's in order, sir." But the moment passed between them like a quiet handshake of shared assumptions. Samantha caught it. Not just the words, but the dance around them, the passive tone, the careful phrasing, the attempt to sound reasonable while drawing a line around who belonged and who didn't. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She'd seen this move before. When the lunch service began, the difference was harder to ignore. The passenger 2 rows ahead received his salmon with warm bread and sparkling water in a crystal glass. The woman beside him, a self-proclaimed wellness coach, was offered her pick of gluten-free options and a handwritten note welcoming her on board. When the cart reached Samantha, a boxed meal was quietly placed in front of her. No menu, no questions, no eye contact, just a sealed container with a cold sandwich and a fruit cup. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't even subtle. It was an unspoken conclusion drawn from an assumption that she didn't need choices, or that offering them would be wasted effort. She looked at the box, then at the attendant, who quickly moved on without waiting for acknowledgement. It wasn't about food. It never was. It was about who the system silently deemed worthy of options, and who it expected to just accept what was handed. Later, when Samantha rose to stretch near the galley, she caught a brief, unintended exchange. A pair of crew members were quietly talking, unaware that she was within earshot. What was her name again, one asked. Royce. Samantha Royce? The other shrugged. Doesn't sound familiar. Thought they said we had VIPs on board. Yeah, but you know how people are. Probably just someone with points or employee family perks. Looks like she works for the airport. Samantha stood quietly until they noticed her. When their eyes met hers, their expressions shifted not to guilt, but to defensiveness. The kind that rises when someone realizes they've underestimated the wrong person. She didn't comment. She just nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the moment, but choosing not to give it more power than it deserved. The plane hummed on. A fourth moment, smaller but more telling, happened when a flight supervisor double-checked the passenger manifest mid-flight. She carried a small tablet and scanned the names in first class. 3 were marked in red, flagged as VIP discreet, a code used internally for individuals with influence who preferred not to be treated like celebrities, but whose presence was important to note. The supervisor paused when she reached Samantha's name. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Then she rechecked the row number. She looked up, then back at the screen. A beat passed, then another. The supervisor turned and disappeared toward the front. her steps a touch quicker than before. No announcement, no apology, just the quiet rush of someone realizing they might have made a mistake that mattered more than they thought. Throughout it all, Samantha remained composed not because she was unbothered, but because she had long ago learned the value of restraint. She didn't react in anger. She didn't raise her voice or demand to speak to anyone. She understood that some of the deepest corrections didn't require confrontation. They required patience and presence. She simply let people reveal themselves. Some, like the passenger across the aisle, did so clumsily. Others, like the crew in the galley, did so casually, never thinking twice about what they said when they believed no one important was listening. But Samantha was listening. She always had been. The power dynamic on that flight had never been about titles, not in the way people imagined. It wasn't about a badge or a public announcement or a loud declaration of who she was. It was about observation. Influence often speaks in silence, and Samantha was fluent in that language. Every detail was a thread, every interaction a signal, and the pattern forming was loud, even if the voices around her tried to whisper through it. The difference now was simple. The woman sitting in seat 2A wasn't just watching. She was remembering, recording, not in a bitter way, but in a professional one, in the way a systems thinker notices flaws, not to punish, but to repair, to rebuild, and sometimes to replace. This wasn't personal, not entirely. Samantha wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone or starting a social media moment. She had no use for viral confrontation. Her concern was structural. Patterns, culture, the kind of quiet exclusion that didn't make headlines, but eroded trust over time. This flight was just one instance, but it was also a mirror of something larger, something embedded in how we define professionalism, value, and belonging without ever saying a word. That was the real turbulence, not the kind that shook trays or spilled coffee. The kind that revealed itself in subtle slights and soft assumptions, and that turbulence was rising. The flight began its descent over the shimmering sprawl of San Francisco, and the cabin adjusted accordingly, seats upright, trays locked, final glances exchanged as passengers prepared to disembark. Samantha remained still, her hands resting on her lap, eyes focused not on the skyline, but on a quiet thought that had settled in sometime over Colorado. The time for watching had ended. The time for reminding had begun. She didn't make any announcement. There was no dramatic gesture, just a soft click as she opened the tablet on her lap and tapped a single button in the Notes app. Phase 1 complete. No exclamation mark, no complaint log, just data, a careful summary of what had occurred, recorded for internal use. She knew this flight would be cross-referenced with others, that patterns would be examined across routes, regions, crews. She didn't need to raise her voice because her role wasn't performative. It was structural. Her presence on this plane had always been purposeful, even if no one else saw it until too late. As the aircraft taxied, a voice from the front of the cabin interrupted the quiet routine. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest flying with us today, Samantha D. Royce. On behalf of the crew, welcome to San Francisco. The voice trembled slightly. It was the flight supervisor, the one who had double-checked the manifest and, at some point during the last 30 minutes, realized who was sitting in 2A. Samantha didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't look up. She just closed the tablet and waited. Around her, passengers stirred, a few turned. A couple of glances lingered longer this time. The man across the aisle blinked slowly, recognition sinking in. without explanation. And perhaps that was what unsettled him most, that he didn't understand why her name mattered. At the gate, a young representative from the airline's corporate team stood waiting with a discreet placard. She approached Samantha with practiced warmth, not the forced cheer of customer service, but the measured professionalism of someone who had been briefed only moments ago. "Ms. Royce, we have a car ready for you. The executive team is aware of your arrival. If there's anything you need," Samantha raised a hand gently, her voice low. "Thank you. I'll walk." The woman hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. Samantha moved through the jet bridge, her steps calm, her posture relaxed. There was no entourage, no press, just a black woman walking through the terminal with a presence that made people look twice and wonder what they'd missed. Outside, the city air was cool and the sky a soft gray. As she walked toward the curb, her phone buzzed. A message from her deputy, internal presentation rescheduled to 4 p.m. They're asking for the full report. She smiled faintly and typed a single word in reply: "Ready." What happened next didn't go viral. There was no video, no hashtags, no trending moment. But within the week, a memo circulated through the airline's executive channels. It detailed inconsistencies in service delivery across multiple flights, particularly on premium routes. Embedded in the report were anonymized quotes, behavioral logs, and side-by-side breakdowns of how passengers were treated, differentiated not by class of ticket, but by perceived identity. There were no accusations, just numbers, patterns, a mirror held up, without anger, to the habits that shaped customer experience more than anyone cared to admit. In a follow-up meeting, someone asked, "Why didn't she say something on the flight?" The room was quiet for a beat before a senior partner responded, "Because she didn't need to. That's what makes it powerful." Samantha wasn't trying to embarrass a company. She was showing them themselves. That was the twist, that the woman they assumed was invisible was not only seen but had seen everything. That she didn't carry resentment, but responsibility. That she wasn't there to disrupt, but to measure the distance between policy and practice. The flight crew never received a punishment, not in the traditional sense, but they were assigned to cultural equity training, one-on-one sessions, not as discipline, but development. The airline quietly updated its first-class protocol manuals. Unconscious bias training became mandatory for premium staff. The changes were subtle, but real. New hires were evaluated not just on technical skill, but on interpersonal nuance. Service scenarios were rewritten. Feedback from underrepresented passengers was reviewed monthly, not quarterly. Back in her office, Samantha reviewed the data without judgment. She didn't need an apology. What she needed, what she demanded by merely existing in the space, was a shift. And shifts like that didn't happen because someone shouted. They happened because someone paid attention, because someone who wasn't supposed to be there sat down anyway and stayed, because someone let the silence speak. This was not revenge. It was a recalibration. There's something about being underestimated that never fully fades. Not even when you've climbed higher than anyone expected. Not even when you've earned the titles, the offices, the access. It stays with you in small moments. In the way someone hesitates before calling you ma'am. In the way an extra glance follows you through a lobby. In the slight pause before a greeting, when someone is recalibrating your place in the room. Samantha Royce knew those moments intimately, not as wounds, but as reminders. Not of what she lacked, but of what others had yet to see. What happened on that flight wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to her. It wasn't violent. It wasn't overt. It wasn't even particularly unique. And maybe that's what made it worth telling. Because stories don't always need screaming or sirens to matter. Sometimes, the quiet ones, the ones with clipped tones, missed names, or boxed meals say just as much. They reveal how far we've come, and how far we haven't. But what made this story different wasn't the missteps. It was the response. It was the decision not to shame, but to mirror, not to punish, but to shift. Samantha didn't want retribution. She wanted reflection. She wanted systems to see what they often denied, that perception is policy. And silence doesn't mean consent. It often means calculation. The real power wasn't in her title, or her firm, or even in the quiet panic that followed the realization of who she was. The real power was in her stillness, in her ability to let people walk themselves into their assumptions and then live with what they found there. That's the part we forget, sometimes. That justice isn't always loud, that not every win comes with headlines. Some victories are soft, quiet, unseen by the world, but deeply felt by those who needed them. And sometimes, the strongest kind of change doesn't happen because someone demanded it. It happens because someone bore witness and didn't look away. We like stories with villains and heroes. We like clear lines. But life rarely offers them. People aren't always malicious. They're often just unaware, conditioned, moving through habits passed down like heirlooms, rarely examined, rarely questioned. Samantha understood that. She didn't need to villainize anyone to prove her worth. She just needed to be present long enough for the room to realize what it missed. And maybe that's what this story asks of us. Not outrage, not guilt, but attention. Attention to the moments we brush off, to the small ways we define who belongs, to the questions we ask without thinking, to the labels we apply without care. It asks us to slow down just enough to wonder if someone like Samantha Royce can be misjudged so easily. How many others have we overlooked? So no, she didn't flip a table. She didn't demand respect. She simply acted like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to observe. And in doing so, she changed the story not just for herself, but for everyone who would sit in that seat after her. Sometimes, all it takes to shift the sky is for the right person to fly under the radar, just long enough to show the system what it missed.